Welcome agents. Warning, controversial video inbound. Should the Division 2 be PvE only? That is the topic of this video, and I can already feel both sides of the argument heading down to that comment section below. Stop, just watch the video first. I think it's an interesting topic to tackle, and before I decided to invest in this video, I put the question here in my community tab and on Twitter to get a feel for what the small portion of the community thinks. Now, as you can see from the voting, it appears that 2/3 believe the Division 2 should be not PvE only and there should be PvP, so we're just going to jump straight into this topic. If you enjoy this one, please hit the like button below, subscribe for dedicated Division 2 content, and let's do this. It's safe to say that before the Division 2 launched, I never thought I'd be making a video like this. Now, that's not to say I think the Division 2 should be PvE only, but I've certainly questioned the need for any PvP in this game as of late. This is the first game I've played with a PvP element that's there where I don't actually want to play any PvP. And that's for two main reasons. PvP in its current state is just not very good, and I actually really enjoy the PvE experience of this game. Now, since the inception of the franchise with the Division, PvE and PvP have never really worked in combination. You could go back to the Division Dark Zone or PvP and say they worked fine, but if you're really being honest with yourself, they didn't work fine at all. We just kind of worked through it all and managed to enjoy them. There was some fun there, but they didn't really work. The main issue with the Division was the developers could not balance both PvE and PvP separately, meaning that any changes for the sake of PvP more than likely affected PvE and likewise, the other way around. It was a constant battle that never really got resolved. With that in mind, and in preparation for the Division 2, the developers clearly went back to the drawing board and they put a system in place where that wouldn't become a problem again. A system that allowed them to balance both aspects separately, so they could balance PvE and they could balance PvP separately, and you'd think, well, that should fix that issue. It's definitely a step in the right direction, there is no doubt about that. But it's not uncommon even now to see PvP players or PvE players complain about changes which affect them. Take, for example, the change to the deflector drone. I've seen PvE players complain about the nerf within PvP recently because it was affected in PvE also, where there wasn't actually a problem. So this is where you get that overlap that I didn't think we were going to see in this game. There will never actually be true balancing that separates both the PvE and PvP aspects of the game. And I think that's just something I've come to realise, and we should all come to realise. So there are two questions I think that could give me, or give you, some good idea on whether the Division 2 needs PvP. How would the game benefit from the removal of PvP, and how would the game suffer? So let's start with how the game would suffer. Going back to the Division for reference, the main reason why this game, the Division, survived for as long as it did was because of the PvP. It was because of the Dark Zone, Last Stand and Conflict that it survived, because let's be frank, the PvE endgame was really not there at all. The incursions were not enough to sustain a robust PvE audience, although they did kind of get better over time. There was Resistance, which was actually quite good fun, and it did actually have some real good replayability factor, but ultimately the endgame began and it stopped at the Dark Zone. And that's because the game was made that way, that's how it was sold. The game was made to be about the Dark Zone. It was meant to be about the PvE VP environment, hence why the game shipped with no real PvE only endgame content. PvP kept the Division going, and there's a real chance the same could happen with the Division 2. I know plenty of people who would drop the game in an instant if PvP were removed, so there's a real risk the game would actually not survive without any PvP. The removal of PvP leaves only PvE. Now, whilst I love the PvE in the Division 2, my roots will always be in PvP. In my opinion, no PvE content could ever sustain me or an audience longer than good PvP content. PvE will eventually become boring. The Division 2 tried to avoid this, and they added sort of replayability factors into a lot of their missions by having dynamic spawning, but ultimately, once you've done a mission or you've done a raid, or any PvE content for that matter, a couple of times, you learn the spawns, you learn the timings, and it becomes a chore, at least for me anyway. PvP offers something different every single time without fail. You never know what sort of player or what sort of team you're going to be facing, so the competition will always be different. This is of course my perspective because I know people who would happily play PvE content all day, every single day, and haven't got a care in the world for PvP, and that's, of course, that's absolutely fine. I just know I would eventually get bored without any real PvP action to sustain my interest. It's mainly the reason why I've not actually been playing The Division 2 a lot recently. My time has definitely dwindled. Just because I've done all of the PvE stuff, aside from the raid, which I am going to actually be stepping back into shortly, hopefully to get that Eagle Bearer. Hopefully, I know I'm completely against it, but it'd be nice to actually have the weapon regardless. And the PvP at the moment is just not capturing my interest like it did in The Division, so I'm not really playing the game a whole lot right now. So as I said, The Division 1 was built with PvP and the Dark Zone certainly in mind. The Division 2, however, was deliberately built to appease the wider PvE audience in an attempt to rectify the mistakes from the first game, i.e. not having any sort of real PvE endgame material. Just look at how much PvE content there is in this game right now, and it just becomes very clear very quickly that it was built for PvE. Now, PvP had clearly been given the back seat here, and I completely understand why the developers went this route. The PvE audience makes up the vast majority of the game, and having a solid PvE experience in a loot-to-shoot a game like this will always be better than the latter. Now, this explains why PvP is just not in a good place right now. So, how would the game benefit from there being no PvP? If it would just be removed, what would be the benefits? Looking back on what I've said before, the removal of PvP would remove the balancing issues between the two, which is, again, is still a real issue right now, and it would actually free up a lot of time for the developers to work on the core PvE experience, more. Now, I know there are issues with PvE as well, but generally the whole PvE experience is good, and it would be nice to see the developers just invest all the time there. Now, Episode 1 offered 2 new good missions, the first expedition, and a lot of changes to the core game. Now, I've said before, I wasn't overly impressed with the expeditions for Episode 1, but imagine what the developers could do with the PvE experience if they didn't have to worry about any PvP related issues. Now, I know the developers haven't really done a whole lot with PvP since launch, and I'm sure some of you guys are already putting that in the comments, but you'd be naive to think that Red Storm, who deal with the PvP stuff, have not actually been doing anything at all, especially when you consider that Title Update 6, which should be dropping soon, will focus on PvP as one of its core points. The developers have had a real effort with this game to offer the bare minimum, in respect of PvP and do everything they can for PvE. So why have PvP at all? For me at least, no PvP is better than a broken PvP experience. After looking at the 100 or more comments to this question of The Division 2 being PvE only, the majority say the game needs PvP. But in that same breath, I think we can all recognise that the PvE experience should come first. I'm not saying it should come at the expense of PvP, but PvE should always come first. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I think for this game, which was clearly built mainly for PvE, that it really is the only way forward. With that said, I think the main reason why I wanted to discuss this topic today was because I know in my heart of hearts, if the developers deliver on their promises of fixing PvP and offering, a new experience and all that sort of stuff, now I will absolutely return to playing PvP on a daily basis. And I will probably make a video in the future titled, The Division 2 promises, or The Division 2 should have PvP, and here's why. There's just too much stuff right now affecting PvP that for me, PvE is really the only option, and it made me consider the game without any PvP and the impact this might have. Ultimately, I think the game needs both, with the emphasis on fixing PvP, but PvE coming first. I've said PvP and PvE a lot in this video. Now, I'm optimistic that with TU6, that'll fix the main reasons why players, myself included, are not engaging in the PvP at the moment. I'm probably not playing the game as much as they'd like for PvE as well, with, PvP being a huge focus, loot, RNG, and all of that other good stuff. So, I hope you enjoyed this one. I knew this would be controversial, just based on the response to the polls I put out. I think I always thought that the Division should always have PvP, but with the state it's in, I've just been asking myself, is there any actual point of having it in the game? And I just really wanted to get the community feedback. I was curious. Now, if the developers can fix the PvP, and knowing that they ultimately can balance each part separately, I can envisage a world where both the PvE and PvP audience for this game are happy. Right now, we're obviously not quite there, but I do have the utmost faith in Massive to turn it around. The Division 2 should always have PvP, and I'm going to end it on that note. Thanks for watching, and a big thanks if you stuck around until the end. Until the next one, Epic out.